Hello, social studies scholars. Mrs. Olson here. Today's lesson is titled The Intolerable Acts. Now, before we get into today's lesson, let's go over a little bit about the unit that we were studying, which was colonial America. So we learned why the settlers came over from England, what life was like when they first got here, the types of governments they set up, the regions in which they settled, and now we're going to talk about the colonists breaking away from England or from Britain. Okay, so we're leading up to the American Revolution, and this is a big war with many events, battles, and people. So before we get to the actual American Revolution, we have to figure out all of the steps that it took to break away from England. Now, the word tolerate, so tolerable, tolerate, means that you can put up with, you are okay with. If it's intolerable, you cannot put up with them. So there are going to be a bunch of decisions and laws that are made for the colonists that were intolerable to them. Okay, so our learning target reads that you will be able to understand why the colonists protested against British rule. Make sure that you have pen and paper handy, or you have another window open with a word processing program so that you can take notes. And remember, it's always okay to pause so that you can get down important information. Here we go. And here we go. Okay, so the colonies are costing money. And who is it costing money for? Well, remember that America is a new world colony of Britain. So Britain is the country that has to put up money for the colonists to be able to survive. So I'm going to move me just for a second. So the King of Britain is named King George III, and he instituted acts. Now, instituted means that you put into effect. Acts can also be called laws. So King George III of Britain instituted acts to govern his colonies. And that's what this lesson is going to be about, the intolerable acts or the intolerable laws. Okay? So this note reads that the French and Indian War cost money and he had to find a way to pay for it. Wars are costly. You have to pay for your soldiers. You have to feed them, clothe them, house them, keep them safe, right? Weapons cost money. So the French and Indian War that the British were a part of, it cost money, and King George had to find a way to pay for it. Now, another part of this story is that the colonists, they wanted to rule themselves. So while they're an English colony, they don't want to listen to King George. Okay, and the colonies wanted to be financed from British government, but they didn't want to follow their rules. So they want to be able to use British money to protect them, say, against Native American raids. That's just one example. But they didn't want to have to listen to King George. So let's put this into perspective a little bit. Okay, whoops, I'm going to go back just a second. This is like when you ask your parents for money, but you don't want to do chores or follow their rules. Like maybe they say, okay, you earn $5 a week or something like that. Or maybe they just give you the money, but you have to be nice to your brothers and sisters. I want you to keep your room clean. I ask you to take out the garbage every other day. So that's like the colonists saying, okay, King George, we want your money, but we don't want to follow your laws. Okay. So here are the series of intolerable acts. Proclamation of 1763, it prohibited settlement west of the Appalachians. So the Appalachians are a mountain range kind of on the eastern side of the United States. And King George doesn't want anybody going west. So if you think of a map of the United States, he doesn't want anybody going left of the Appalachians, because there wasn't any guarantee that Native American tribes wouldn't attack. And when they do, King George loses colonists, he loses ways in which England can make money. So the Proclamation of 1763 says nobody can go west. Okay. Now, the colonists were offended that King George was telling them how to govern their land. They didn't like this. If they wanted to go west, well, then they wanted to go west, and they didn't want a king telling them that they couldn't. Okay, here is a map that shows us the eastern part of the United States, okay? In yellow, you can see that these are the 13 colonies, and here runs the Appalachian Mountain Range. So right here, I hope you can see that it says the Proclamation line of 1763. This is where King George does not want them to go past, because this is where they have pushed Native Americans. As you can see, it says Indian Reserve. All right. Now we're getting into more of the Intolerable Acts, and one of them is called the Sugar Act. King George places a tax on sugar, wine, and molasses. Hence, that's why it's called the Sugar Act. So sugar, of course, there is sugar in wine. Molasses is like sugar. So all of these are sweet, and King George says that there is extra money put on top of these products when we sell them. So New England, remember the top portion of the 13 colonies, the New England colonies bought molasses to make rum, and they sold those to other colonies. So they're going to be upset because there's a tax on molasses, which makes molasses more expensive, okay? Which means that it's going to cost them more to make rum, and it's going to hurt their profits when they sell it to other colonies. So for example, the other colonies that they're selling the rum to are French colonies, Dutch colonies, and Spanish colonies. Okay, more on the Sugar Act. It was passed in 1763, and the tax worried colonial leaders because they feared that Britain was trying to seize, and seize means to take power from colonial governments by telling them what to do and taking money away from them. Okay, so here is a graphic that gives you the idea of how constricted the colonists felt with some of these intolerable acts. So here is the British emblem, the Atlantic Ocean as the divide, and here is a British person kind of pulling the strings, if you will, of the colonists. Okay, the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act didn't generate enough money, meaning that King George wanted to make money off of this tax. Well, it didn't make him enough money, so he comes up with the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was passed in 1765, so 2 years after the Sugar Act. And what it did was it made the colonists buy and place stamps on all different kinds of paper goods, and you can see the list here. Okay, so pause it if you want to write those down. Now, everyone was affected by the tax, the Stamp Act, because everybody uses some kind of paper, some kind of document. What this meant was that not very many people could afford to buy books. This made the colonists really upset, and they started to chant a phrase and use it all the time with the Intolerable Acts, and that phrase was, "No tax without representation. No tax without representation." And what that meant was that they were being taxed by King George, but they didn't have a say in it. So nowadays in the United States, we all vote. When you turn the age of 18, you have the right to vote, meaning that you get a say in rules and laws that are made for the country. The colonists were having these rules and laws put upon them, but they didn't get a voice. They didn't get a say in what was happening to them. No tax without representation. Okay, so here are pictures of those stamps that were put on marriage licenses, mailing a letter, for example. Okay, here is the next Intolerable Act, and it's called the Quartering Act. So, the Quartering Act, let's read it together, says that it required the colonies to provide food, drink, quarters. Oops, I should fix this. This should be a parentheses. I'm sorry about that. So quarters means a lodging. You have to provide a place for them to stay. Okay, that's why it's called the Quartering Act. And fuel to British soldiers stationed in their towns or villages. So the Quartering Act is saying that you have a house, you have to give up your bedrooms, you have to give up your living room, the soldiers get to stay there, and you have to feed them. And if you have fuel, like wood or coal, then you have to be able to give that to the British soldiers. Okay? Now, colonists, when they put up the British soldiers in their houses, didn't get paid for providing quarters for the British Army. So can you imagine the president saying, okay, U.S. Army soldiers are going to stay in your house and you have to feed them and make sure that they have a bed to sleep in, but your parents don't get paid for providing for the soldiers? You probably wouldn't like that. Your family probably wouldn't like that. Okay. So here are pictures that represent the Quartering Act. You can pause it if you want to look at it for a little bit longer. Okay, now we're moving to the Townshend Acts. Now, the Townshend Acts were actually a couple of different acts, and what it did was to place new taxes and actually took away some colonial freedom. And so there were a couple of these that were passed in 1767 and 1768, so over a 2-year time period. Now, the idea with the Townshend Acts is that the money generated from the taxes was supposed to pay the salaries of governors and judges. Somebody has to pay them, and the British government was paying them. So they were trying to generate money from the tax to pay the governors and judges. Okay, so what they decided to do was to put tax on imports like paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. And this last one is going to lead us into the Boston Tea Party. So hold the phone on that one. We get to learn about that one pretty soon. Okay, so here are some pictures that represent a few of the Townshend Acts, and you can see that this says tax on tea. You can see that a lot of this is going to anger the colonists because of the tea part of it. Okay, now coming to the end, what was a result of all of these intolerable acts? Well, the colonists became very upset that the decisions were being made without their voice. Remember the phrase? Can you say it? Do you remember it? No tax without representation. You can't make laws for us, King George, if we don't get a say in those laws. There it is, no tax without representation. Okay, so what they did, so this is the result, what the colonists did is they started to protest, they started to organize boycotts, and a boycott is when you say that you're not going to buy something, you're not going to pay somebody to use their services, so somebody's going to lose out on money. and they started to smuggle goods. So instead of paying the tax, say, on sugar, they might bring in sugar from another source besides the British and not tell the British they were doing it, and maybe do it in the middle of the night, and then they wouldn't have to pay the British the tax. Now the British started to find out about them smuggling in these goods. Okay, so here's another graphic. No Sugar Act, no Tea Act, no Stamp Act. The colonists were tired of King George making rules for them. And that is the end of our Intolerable Acts. Remember, the reason why you're learning about this is the road that leads to the American Revolution. All right, hope you took good notes, because now you are going to answer a set of lesson questions. Ask me questions if you guys have them. Bye!